How does a line with no color, no wall, and no physical form get someone killed for stepping over it? Why did a species that spent nearly 300,000 years wandering freely suddenly need permission just to stand somewhere? What if the story most people believe about how countries formed is backward? And how did an idea invented by a handful of grain farmers end up ruling 8 billion people today? 70,000 years ago, a person could walk from the eastern edge of Africa to the western edge of Europe without a single checkpoint, document, or permission slip. No country existed to stop them, because no country existed at all. That same walk today would require dozens of stamps, approvals, and a passport that expires. Somewhere between those 2 points in time, humans invented an idea so powerful it now decides who lives, who gets turned away, and who is treated as illegal simply for standing in the wrong spot. For most of human history, a country was not a birthright, a bloodline, or a fact of geography. It was invented, built backward, as a tool of control first, and dressed up as an identity second. The timeline starts earlier than most people assume. In 2017, researchers led by paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology dated fossils at Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, to roughly 300,000 years old, pushing back the known origin of Homo sapiens by more than 100,000 years. For nearly all of that span, humans lived in small, mobile bands, rarely larger than a few dozen people, moving with seasons and herds rather than settling behind any fixed line. Anthropologist Elman Service, working at the University of Michigan, mapped out how that changed in 1962, with a model still taught today: bands, then tribes, then chiefdoms, then states, a slow climb with no fixed borders anywhere on the first 3 rungs. So somewhere on that ladder, something changed. And it did not happen because anyone voted for it. Around 3100 BC, in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, a city called Uruk grew walls, granaries, and something entirely new: a ruling class that could count, measure, and tax its own people. Yale professor James C. Scott laid out the mechanism in his 2017 book, Against the Grain. His argument cuts hard against the textbook version of history. Grain, he found, was the first crop that could be seen, counted, and confiscated by a ruler, unlike root vegetables or wild game, which could be hidden or hunted out of reach. Sitting in visible rows and stored in countable piles, grain made a population taxable for the first time. Walls went up not to protect an identity, but to stop a tax base from walking away. The state, in other words, came first. It existed to extract, not to express who anybody was. But if the machinery came before the feeling, then where did the feeling come from? The sense of belonging to a nation, of loving a homeland enough to die for it? Political scientist Benedict Anderson, teaching at Cornell University, answered that question in 1983 with a term that reshaped the entire field: imagined communities. A nation, Anderson argued, is a group of people who will never meet almost anyone else in it, yet feel connected anyway. A connection manufactured through shared newspapers, shared calendars, and a common printed language that let millions of strangers picture themselves as one body. The identity was not the seed of the state. It was the glue applied afterward, once rulers already needed a way to hold large, scattered, tax-paying populations together. It is a strange thought. The feeling of loving a homeland arrived after the tax office already had a name for that homeland on file. That glue needed physical proof to feel real, and the 19th century manufactured it on demand. Historian Eric Hobsbawm of Birkbeck College at the University of London spent decades documenting this in his 1983 book, The Invention of Tradition, co-written with Terence Ranger. Hobsbawm found that many of the rituals people assume are ancient, national anthems, official flags, royal ceremonies, even the tartan patterns associated with specific Scottish clans, were actually designed and standardized within a few decades of the 1800s, often by committees, printers, and government offices working to make a young or shaky state feel timeless. A tradition did not need centuries behind it. It only needed enough repetition, and enough people willing to believe it had always been there. So the pattern doubles back on itself. First a wall to hold grain, then a story to hold strangers together, then a manufactured ceremony to make that story feel ancient. The idea of a country as it is understood now, a fixed, bordered territory recognized as equal and sovereign by other such territories, did not exist as a formal system until shockingly recently. In 1648, in the German cities of Münster and Osnabrück, diplomats ended the 30 Years' War with a set of treaties now known as the Peace of Westphalia. Legal scholar Leo Gross, writing in the American Journal of International Law in 1948, described how that settlement quietly established what is now called Westphalian sovereignty, the principle that a territory's rulers answer to no higher authority, and that borders, once drawn, are fixed and mutually respected. Before that agreement, authority in Europe overlapped constantly, with kings, popes, and emperors all claiming jurisdiction over the same land at once. After it, the modern idea of a country, one government, one clearly bounded territory, finally had a legal template. Once one part of the world adopted that template, it did not stay contained for long. In 1884, Otto von Bismarck hosted representatives from 14 nations in Berlin to formally divide an entire continent. Over the following months, the Berlin Conference carved Africa into territories using straight lines on a map, ignoring the hundreds of existing kingdoms, language groups, and trade networks already there. Borders that had never existed on the ground were drawn in a room thousands of miles away, proof that by the late 19th century, the invention was no longer just an idea. It had become an exportable tool, powerful enough to reshape a continent its authors had mostly never set foot on. The final piece of the invention was the one that made it enforceable on a single individual level. In 1922, Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen, working through the League of Nations, introduced a travel document for stateless refugees left behind by collapsing empires, the Nansen Passport. It became one of the first internationally recognized papers built entirely around a person's relationship to a country, or the lack of one. For the first time, belonging to a country, or failing to belong to one, became something a person had to physically carry. The ground itself never changed through any of this. A river crossing 3 countries still carries the same water on every side of every line. A mountain range still ignores the borders drawn across it on every map ever printed. What changed was layered entirely on top of the ground, walls that hardened into laws, a manufactured feeling that hardened into identity, a treaty that hardened into a template, and a piece of paper that turned all of it into something a person has to prove on demand. 70,000 years ago, that walk out of Africa and into Europe required nothing but time and endurance. Today, the same walk would require a stack of paperwork thick enough to trace the entire arc of political history behind it. Grain counted in Uruk, a feeling manufactured by newspapers, a treaty signed in 2 German cities, lines drawn in a room in Berlin, and a paper document invented to track the difference between belonging and not. The ground never changed, only the story drawn on top of it,